What is pre-war steel, and why are people stealing it? Pre-war steel is extremely valuable, as it is the only material used in a number of applications. We will cover the why in the article, but in the beginning, many people illegally dismantle underwater wrecks declared as military memorials because of the precious metal. The detonation of the first atomic bomb irrevocably changed the world. Literally, the impact of the Trinity test on July 16, 1945 could be felt around the world. Not long after, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs within a month on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which ended the Second World War, but ushered in the nuclear age. And the effects of the atomic age live with us to this day, including in the air we breathe. The latter statement indicates that since 1945 the amount of background radiation in the air has increased, which also affected steel production. Although steel is an old invention, its history reached a turning point with the Bessemer process. The British metallurgist Henry Bessemer invented the process of blowing pig iron into steel after it was taken out of the furnace. This process then became fully operational in 1864, and thus the modern became one of the most important production developments of the age. The problem was that if the level of radioactive contamination in the air increased, this also appeared in the steel during the Bessemer process, meaning that the resulting material became slightly radioactive. Another way to produce steel is recycling. However, radioactive contamination appeared even in the case of this process. Although we are talking about a small amount of radiation, it can cause quite a lot of problems in certain application areas. Imagine, for example, that we want a sensor that needs to be extremely sensitive to low-level radiation. These could be Geiger counters, medical devices, or even vehicles for space exploration. If these instruments get a slightly radioactive coating, this already creates an unacceptable amount of background noise. As you can see, we have been producing such devices in quite large numbers since 1945. So the question is, where does the steel used for these come from? By definition, we need a metal that was made before the Trinity test, and there is such a thing, typically in the form of shipwrecks sunk at the bottom of the ocean during World War II. The steel used for these was made before the level of radioactive substances in the atmosphere increased, and they were not reused, so they could not be contaminated that way either. From such sources, there are acceptable as well as less acceptable from the point of view of mercy. After the First World War, the defeated Germans deliberately sunk their high seas fleet in the waters of Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, Scotland. British sailors managed to bring a few ships ashore, but more than 50 were buried in the waves. For a long time they did not know what a valuable resource all this was, but later the plates of the sunken ships were used in hospitals from Scotland to the United States. But the steel from these ships ended up in Voyager 1 or even Explorer 1, so far from the place and purpose for which the metallurgists originally intended them. The above action was relatively peaceful, although 9 Germans were killed when the British opened fire to prevent the action. However, most of the pre-war steel ships met a much more violent fate. Hundreds of ships have sunk to the depths of the South China and Java Seas, all victims of the brutal battles of the Second World War. The bodies of thousands of sailors rest on the ships. In recent times, 40 of these ships have been partially or completely destroyed. Dismantling the ships can take weeks. Divers carry explosives down to the wrecks, where they fix them, then detonate them to break the ships into smaller pieces. The barges then lift the pieces to the surface using cranes. However, this practice is completely illegal, so the crew also disguises the operation as if they were operating simple fishing boats. Earlier, for example, the Malaysian authorities intercepted a Chinese-registered ship on which ammunition from the British HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse was found. The problem of contaminated steel, and thus the methodical destruction of military memorials, seems to be solved over time. After 1975, testing went underground, reducing, but not completely eliminating, the amount of radiation entering the air. Since the various agreements ending the testing of nuclear weapons, and thanks to the short half-life of some radioactive isotopes, the background radiation in the air is gradually decreasing. Cobalt-60 has a half-life of 5.26 years, which means that the steel itself is becoming less and less radioactive. The newer BOSS, basic oxygen steelmaking, technique, which has been used since the 1960s, also exposes the steel to less contamination than the Bessemer process, since pure oxygen is used instead of blowing air in this process. It is interesting, but not only World War II wreckage is used as a raw material. From the point of view of modern detection devices, lead from the Roman period is also an incredibly important source. Thanks for watching.